Clear over here.
Something's not right. Check this out.
Police! Don't move!
Stop! Police! Get on the ground!
The condominium on Misty Morning Drive in Derry, New Hampshire looked unremarkable from the outside. A quiet neighborhood,
Hello?
modest lawns, the kind of place where nothing terrible was supposed to happen. But on the night of May 1st, 1990, something terrible had already happened by the time Pamela Smart pulled into the parking lot. She had been at a school board meeting that evening, or so she said. She returned home sometime after 9 o'clock to find the front door unlocked, the interior ransacked, and her 24-year-old husband, Gregg Smart, lying on the floor of the entrance hallway. He had been shot once in the head at close range. He was still wearing his shoes. He had not had time to take them off. Gregg Smart worked as an insurance salesman. He was, by most accounts, an affable young man, someone who had moved to Florida to be with Pamela during her final year at Florida State University, who had married her in 1989 with the easy optimism of someone who believed the future would be kind. He was 24 years old when he died.
Pamela called 911. Her voice on the recording was distressed, fractured, the sound of a woman in shock, or of a woman performing shock, depending on who was listening. Investigators would later parse that call many times over, looking for something they could not quite name yet. The first officers on the scene noted the ransacked rooms, drawers pulled open, items displaced, the surface suggestion of a burglary gone wrong. But something about the scene did not settle comfortably into that explanation. The disruption felt staged, too deliberate, too clean in its chaos. Nobody was arrested that night. Nobody was even certain yet what they were really looking at. In the days following Gregg Smart's death, Pamela Smart became a visible, vocal presence in the investigation. She gave interviews. She spoke to reporters. She presented herself as a devastated wife demanding answers. And in the immediate aftermath of a violent crime, that posture was not unusual. Grief takes many shapes. Not everyone collapses inward. But Detective Daniel Pelletier of the Derry Police Department noticed something he could not easily dismiss. Pamela's affect, while not cold, carried a quality that felt rehearsed. She seemed, at certain moments, more interested in the camera than in the casket. Investigators also noted early inconsistencies. Pamela claimed she had wanted to repair her marriage. Friends and colleagues described a woman who seemed in the months before the murder increasingly focused on her own independence, her career as Winnicott High School in Hampton, her social life, her sense of self-determination. The marriage, those close to her suggested, had been strained for some time.
The burglary narrative continued to unravel quietly. Nothing of obvious value had been taken. The ransacking appeared to cover a very specific, very targeted act, a single gunshot wound to the head. Professional in its own grim way. Not the frantic violence of a burglar surprised by a returning homeowner. Premeditated. Investigators widened their scope. They began asking questions not just about who might have wanted Gregg Smart dead, but about who in Pamela's orbit might have been capable or willing to do it. The answers, when they began to surface, would point not toward career criminals or strangers, but toward a circle of teenagers, barely old enough to drive, who had been drawn into something far beyond their years.
William Flynn was 15 years old when he met Pamela Smart through Project Self-Esteem, a drug awareness program at Winnicott High School where both were volunteers. He was a sophomore. She was 22, a married professional with a college degree and a practiced confidence that made her seem, to the teenagers around her, almost mythological. Flynn, by his own later admission, fell quickly. He described it as love, the kind of consuming, disorienting attachment that adolescents are particularly vulnerable to when the object of that attachment is an older authority figure
who knows exactly how to calibrate attention and affection. Pamela Smart, the prosecution would later argue, understood the dynamic entirely. She understood what Flynn wanted. She understood what she needed. And over the months that followed their meeting, she is alleged to have shaped that dynamic with precision, drawing Flynn in, deepening his devotion, and eventually making clear that there was a price attached to her continued affection. That price was her husband's life. Flynn confided in friends, Patrick Randall, Vance Lattimine, and Raymond Fowler. Teenagers navigating a situation none of them had the maturity to fully comprehend. Randall would be the one to enter the condominium with Flynn on the night of May 1st. Lattimine drove, Fowler waited. Flynn pulled the trigger. What compelled them to follow through is a question that resists simple answers. Fear, loyalty, the catastrophic susceptibility of youth to manipulation, all of it likely played a role. What is clear is that 4 teenagers from small-town New Hampshire committed a murder on behalf of a woman who, as far as investigators could determine, never once put herself in the room when it happened. She was, if the prosecution's theory held, the architect of it all. The break in the case came not from physical evidence, but from a conversation. Cecilia Pierce was a teenage intern at Winnicott High School and a friend of both Flynn and Pamela Smart. She occupied an ambiguous position in the social geometry of the case. Young enough to be in Flynn's orbit, close enough to Pamela to have been taken into her confidence. And it was that confidence, investigators believed, that Pierce now carried like a weight. On May 14th, 1990, an anonymous tip reached police indicating that Pierce knew something about the murder. Detectives approached her carefully. She was a minor. She was frightened. But she was also, it became clear, deeply uncomfortable with what she knew. Pierce agreed to cooperate. She agreed to wear a wire. What followed was a series of recorded conversations between Pierce and Pamela Smart. Conversations that, when played back, would prove devastating. In them, Pamela appeared to contradict the very claims she had been making publicly, that she had wanted to save her marriage, that she had no foreknowledge of any plot, that the boys had acted entirely on their own. The tapes did not produce a confession, but they produced something nearly as damaging, a portrait of a woman whose private words and public statements could not be reconciled. Investigators listened. Prosecutors listened. The gap between what Pamela Smart said to the cameras and what she said to a trusted teenage confidant was wide enough to build a case inside. Detective Pelletier, who had been watching Pamela Smart for months with a patient, methodical attention, now had something tangible. The arrest came on August 1st, 1990, in a school parking lot, quietly, without spectacle, in the ordinary daylight of a Wednesday morning. Detective Daniel Pelletier had spoken to Pamela Smart on at least 6 prior occasions during the investigation. She knew him. He knew her. There was a familiarity between them that made the morning of August 1st, 1990, carry a particular weight. He approached her in the parking lot of her school. She saw him coming, and by all accounts, was not yet alarmed. Pelletier had become a familiar presence. Another interview, another round of questions in a case that had been grinding forward for 3 months. "What's up?" she asked. He told her he had good news and bad news. The good news, he said, was that they had solved the murder of her husband. The bad news was that she was under arrest. She asked what for. First-degree murder, he told her. The exchange, recorded, clinical in its plainness, has since become one of the more quoted moments in the case. It carried an almost theatrical quality, the kind of line that belongs in fiction rather than a parking lot in New Hampshire. But it happened. And the woman who had spent 3 months positioning herself as a grieving widow demanding justice was now in handcuffs, being driven to the Derry District Court for arraignment. She was 22 years old. She was subsequently transferred to the New Hampshire State Prison for Women in Goffstown to await trial. The boys, Flynn, Randall, Latimer, Fowler, had already begun negotiating plea deals, each of them now willing to testify against the woman they had, for different reasons and to different degrees, followed into catastrophe. The investigation was over. What came next would be something else entirely. A trial that the entire country, it turned out, was about to watch.
When Pamela Smart's trial opened on March 4th, 1991, at the Rockingham County Superior Court, it was already something more than a murder case. It had become, in the intervening months, a cultural event. Television cameras had been permitted inside the courtroom, one of the first such instances in American legal history. The proceedings were broadcast live. Viewers across the country tuned in daily, drawn by a story that seemed to compress into a single case. Anxieties about sex and power, youth and manipulation, the seductions of ambition, and the violence they could produce. The prosecution, led by Assistant Attorney General Diane Nicolosi, framed its argument in stark, almost archetypal terms. The teenagers, Nicolosi argued, were naive victims, drawn into murder by an older woman who had used intimacy as a weapon. Pamela Smart, the prosecution claimed, had seduced Flynn deliberately, manipulated his devotion, and withheld affection as leverage until he agreed to kill a man whose only crime was being married to her. The financial motive was presented plainly: a $140,000 life insurance policy and the avoidance of a costly divorce. Smart's defense maintained that the affair had been real, but the murder had not been her design. She took the stand and acknowledged the relationship with Flynn, calling it an affair, acknowledging its wrongness, but insisted she had wanted to end it and repair her marriage, and that the killing had been Flynn's own terrible initiative. The jury deliberated. They had the tapes. They had the testimony of the co-conspirators. They had 14 days of evidence, argument, and the particular discomfort of a case in which no answer felt entirely clean. On March 22, 1991, they returned a verdict: guilty on all counts. The sentence was mandatory: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The cameras caught it all.